Entschuldigung. And now we have our first highlight from this conference, Henry Jenkins. And he is one of the, or for me, he is the key thinker in the field of storytelling. And I'm really glad you're here. And yeah, I think Frau Meiric also said what you did, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the speech of Henry Jenkins. Thank you.
Guten Morgen. That's about as much German as I can muster, so you're going to have to deal with me in English, and I apologize. The talk today is derived from a number of projects that I have coming out within the next 6 months that may be of interest to this group. The first of those is a special issue of Transformative Works and Culture, which is due out later this week, which deals with fan activism, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the course of this talk. The second in November will be the 20th anniversary edition of Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture, which is the book where I first coined the term participatory culture. And that's coming out with an extended interview that Suzanne Scott did with me, reflecting on fans and fan studies over the last 20 years. The third will be a book for educators called Reading in a Participatory Culture, which is coming out in December. And that really sums up some of the work we've been doing on new media education in the United States. And probably the most significant of these, coming out in January, is a new book, Spreadable Media, Creating Meaning and Value in a Networked Culture, which I wrote with Sam Ford and Joshua Green. And that really is intended to be part of, I see it as an informal trilogy between Textual Poachers, Convergence Culture, and now Spreadable Media. And most of the ideas in this talk will come from Spreadable Media. Let's see, my media is not so spreadable at the moment. Okay, so the talk is framed around the issue of content, because that was a request from another talk that I was giving along the way. And I'm going to say a few words at the beginning about content. But I think any place the word content appears in this talk, you can easily substitute the word story, because content is being used here the way the content industry means it. But pretty much every example I'm giving in this talk is really an example of stories. Now, the person who asked me to talk about the future of the content industries, my initial volley there was to say that the content has no future. And by that I mean that if you look at the English language definition of the word content, and I don't know enough about the German to know how it works here, but the word content literally means that which is contained. As in the contents of a bottle or in the table of contents of a book. Well, if content is that which is contained, then what I'm going to describe here are 6 trends which break down the process of content. That is, what content has been is stories will exist, great stories will be told, and great experiences will be had, and great images will be circulated, but content as we've understood it as something that is contained, boxed in, will break down over the next chunk of time because of the 6 trends that I'm going to describe here. So what I often do when I'm getting ready to do a talk is I push the keywords into Google image search. And it's a really great discovery process because you see all kinds of things people have generated around that concept. And this is one of the things, if you put content into Google image search, at least in English, what comes up is this cartoon. And the question is, what is more important, content or design? And the person responds, use. And that really is a central thesis of this talk, that content matters for sure. As I said, you've got to have great stories to compel great experiences. And design certainly matters. We want things presented in a very compelling way to take advantage of the affordances of their medium. But in a world of participatory design, use is what's king, right? In the sense that what we do with your content once we receive it is more important to us, at least, if not to you, than anything else. That is, content is simply a resource we use to communicate with each other. It's a vehicle through which we express aspects of ourselves, our self-perceptions, our sense of the world around us. And so in that sense, use and what people do with your content is the central thing. Now, the first of my 6 shifts, or 6 logics of the current moment, is that content is now transmedia. So if it was once contained in the pages of a book, it now is spread across every available media platform. And the challenge of content production and audience engagement are completely woven together. That you cannot create, there means, just as if a tree falls in a forest, it doesn't make any sound unless someone's there to hear it. If you create content that no one sees, it's a meaningless activity, right? So now the desire to build content includes building an engagement with the audience. So this is a good example. This is part of the social media campaign that was built around Hunger Games, which until the Avengers came out was the most commercially successful film in the US box office this year. What it did was rather interesting. It took the metaphors of the story, Hunger Games, and mapped them onto the audience. So they divided the audience in the United States into a series of districts, just like the districts in Hunger Games. Each district had to tweet and share messages about Hunger Games to reach a certain volume, and then they would unlock special content aimed at that specific district. And the content was presented as coming from the sponsors. And in the language of Hunger Games, sponsors are people who give you gifts you need to survive. In the language of marketing, sponsors are the people who pay for your content. So it's a kind of interesting double use of the word sponsors. So when we as a community mobilized around the release of the film, we got extra content, including content that contributed to the story world from the sponsors. And this is just an example of how in advance of a film now, we are seeing more and more content which is partially branding and partially part of the story, right? And that's the interesting paradox. I just spoke right before I left on this trip to the American Screenwriters Guild. We're still struggling with the question of how should they get compensated for the content they are creating in this new digital environment. The industry is saying this is promotion, this is marketing. And as a result, there's a certain scheme of compensation in the States which doesn't give very much of anything to the writer. The writer's expected to help promote their work. If, on the other hand, it's seen as content or part of the story, then the author is able to claim residuals on that content, and any character created in that content that gets used subsequently in the story gives residuals as well. So there's at stake some question of writers' compensation, how the creative industry is going to work, whether transmedia is understood as branding or as part of the story world. And that's a struggle that I think shapes why Americans in particular have been very excited by the idea of transmedia storytelling, because it gives them a much stronger argument for the substantive contribution of creative artists to the development of these franchises. And I think it's a really interesting trend. So here's an example of fictional content / promotional content. This was released in advance of Prometheus, which opened just a week or so back. And Prometheus, in this case, it's a TED Talk by a fictional character from the year 2023. So in this TED Talk, he lays out a lot of exposition about the world the story is set in, what its reality is. It's part of the storytelling process. You already know things about this world if you saw this TED video before you entered the theater. It also is particularly well targeted for the early adapter audience of the internet, because TED is a recognizable brand of quality digital content that people in the know about digital media want to pay attention to. And it was highly spreadable content. It's content that can be embedded in our blogs. We send links along, we tweet about it and so forth. When I first arrived in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, I was greeted with all these bus benches, and you probably saw equivalents here that sort of announced the bus benches for humans only, report non-human use, alien secretions corrode the bench, so forth. And again, this is an advertisement. It's a billboard of sorts. But it's really subtle in that it refers you to the website and you don't even know initially what it's advertising unless you go to the website. But what it also is a piece of exposition. It tells us a lot about the world that District 9 is going to be set in, the basic conflicts of the story, so forth, before we get inside of it. And it's an invitation to perform that world, to become part of that world. As we sit down on that bench, we can imagine ourselves in a future society occupied by alien races, dealing with the politics of District 9 and so forth, which made waiting for the bus in Los Angeles a lot more bearable. Storytelling can extend after the story. So all of those are examples of things that are preceding the story, but storytelling also extends beyond the story. So when Buffy the Vampire Slayer got canceled after 7 seasons, Josh Whedon and his writers simply picked up on the comic books and called the comic books the 8th season and continued the story where the 7th season left off. So this became the canon, the official part of the story of Buffy. And similarly, Ghost Whisperer and Supernatural have used comics to tell backstory that wasn't actually developed on the story, on the television series, but which allows them to extend the timeline of the story. So comics have become increasingly important part of what constitutes the story of television in the American context. So all of this can be seen as examples of what I described in convergence culture as transmedia storytelling, which represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. Whew. That's going to be the longest piece of text you see on any slide the rest of the presentation. But if we break it down, what we're saying is that transmedia storytelling is a story that's told across media, that the pieces are systematically dispersed, that they're coordinated, and there's a unified experience behind it, and that each makes its own unique contribution. So if I take an episode of Glee and I put it on Hulu or iTunes, it's not yet transmedia storytelling. It's moving across platforms, but it hasn't added anything to our comprehension of the story. If, on the other hand, I begin to add new elements to the overall experience, like the examples I've just given you, then it starts to be something that's more systematically dispersed, makes unique contributions, and so forth. Now, the idea of transmedia storytelling in and of itself is not new, nor is the idea of a story as a world, the world as a platform out of which stories unfold. I often, as being an American, I like to tell the American story, so I begin frequently with L. Frank Baum. And L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. And I think as I talk to audiences around the world, they all know the MGM musical with Judy Garland, and they know that this kind of basic story structure of the Dorothy, the hurricane, tornado, and trying to get back home to Kansas and all of that. But that's actually the plot of the first of 20 books L. Frank Baum wrote set in Oz. In addition to that, he created a number of films. He had his own film production company, starting quite early in the history of cinema. He made both short films and feature films that extended that storyline. He created Broadway plays, many of which have distinct plots that were not part of the plots of the books. So a few of the books we read now were, in fact, novelizations of some of those plays. And at one point, there were 2 comic strips competing for Oz readers. One that he created, Baum created, and one that Dinslow created, his artist, illustrator, created his own comic strip in a sort of copyright battle that was going on. And to cap it all, Baum himself toured on vaudeville and music hall and cabaret as a lecturer, presenting himself as the royal geographer of Oz, in which he told about the land, its peoples, its history, borrowing material from all of those different media. So Baum was the man who stitched together this transmedia franchise as he presented it. And he obviously saw himself more as a world builder. Oz was a place more than that generated lots of stories, more than he saw himself as a storyteller, pure and simple. So the idea of transmedia storytelling is not new. What's new is a particular pattern of network consumption. It's our ability to track down pieces of information that are scattered across the media landscape and distill them down for each other, share notes with each other in a particular way. So again, for me, transmedia storytelling is bound up with a particular style of audience engagement that sort of has come into being as we've learned to work and consume in relation to networks. So that's what's most dramatic about the present moment. We have a vocabulary for talking about it now. We have a production system which makes it easier to coordinate. But as early as 1910, L. Frank Baum was telling a story across multiple media, with each medium making a unique contribution and the story unfolding in a systematic and unified way. That's not new. Now, transmedia by itself literally means across media. So we can now, as we're getting deeper into this era of hyper-awareness of transmedia relations, we can say storytelling and branding are only two of a number of other logics through which transmedia unfolds. So, for example, Glee does not engage particularly well in transmedia storytelling. We could imagine them taking the teachers and the students and telling parts of their stories across the web. We could imagine a web-based high school newspaper or yearbook or something that reported on their activities that extended the show. That's not what they've chosen to do. What they've chosen to do is put the music from Glee online, to tour on the stage and do only the performance sequences from Glee. So Glee is an engine for transmedia performance. And as it's done so, it's changed the music industry in fundamental ways. So in 2 years' time, the cast of Glee now have more #1 hit records than Elvis or the Beatles. I mean, a phenomenal success story in terms of their capacity to generate awareness and consumer behavior around the release of music. And some of it is what they've done themselves, but what you see around the Glee poster here are amateur performances of Glee that are released on YouTube. Alex Levitt, who's one of my graduate students, has researched this particular phenomenon, but it turns out there are hundreds, if not thousands, of lip sync videos, of karaoke videos, of anime music videos that remix content in relation to the songs of Glee. All thriving on YouTube, many of them coming up within hours of the musical performance on the television show, and all part of the Glee phenomenon. Now, in this American legal culture, the producers of Glee could easily send a cease and desist letter and take down that content. YouTube's very aggressive about taking down unauthorized content upon request from producers. They haven't done it, right? And we have to assume the reason they haven't done it is that they see it as part of the overall marketing success of the show. That indeed, this is a show about amateur music performances, about high school students taking pop songs and remixing them and reperforming them. It would be hypocritical for Glee to take down this stuff. And so it's part of the phenomenon around Glee. So that brings us to the second of the trends that I'm going to talk about, which is that content is increasingly participatory. In convergence culture, I talk about cultural attractors these are things in the text that draw people together. And cultural activators, those are elements of the text that give people something to do. Now keep in mind, we will do things with your text, whether you authorize us or not, right? People in the entertainment industry often tell me they're worried about losing control. And I look at them and say, you lost control a long time ago. The audience can take and do with your content anything they want, and you can sue and shut down some of them, but you're not going to shut down all of them. And so the goal is not to maintain control, it's to get back in the game. It's to engage with that audience in a productive, generative way, as Glee has done, and simply stepping back and letting it happen. So the producers of Spider-Man, that's coming out later this summer, released kits to encourage people to promote and play with the content of Spider-Man, to become part of Spider-Man's underground army in advance of the film's release. And one of the kits has these stencils which allowed them to spray paint the spider on various locations around the city. So this is a kind of interesting example of authorization, because the content owner, the copyright owner, is authorizing us to appropriate their content and paint it on city walls, but the city hasn't given us permission to do that. Right? So it sort of points to the different levels of control over participation. There are both corporate levels of control and civic or political levels of control that intervene in our ability to participate in our culture. So the struggles of the 21st century are going to be struggles over participation. Who gets to participate? How do we get to participate? How do we extend participation? Those are the core struggles that we are battling as communities at the present moment. Now this page illustrates two aspects of this new participatory culture. The first of all is a Wikipedia entry. And Wikipedia represents a really powerful example of what we can do with collective intelligence, pooling knowledge, working together to produce a reference work that we couldn't produce by ourselves. But it's also the entry on fan fiction, and fan fiction is another kind of participatory culture where storytellers, young and old, are taking the content of mass media and using it as a springboard to create their own short stories and novels, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of stories at this point in circulation. And this is an example of what I call in my writing participatory culture. And this is the definition I gave in a white paper that I wrote for the MacArthur Foundation about 6 years ago, which I describe it as having relatively low barriers for engagement, strong support for sharing creations with others, an informal mentorship system in which more experienced people teach less experienced people. And I phrase it that way because it's not actually always adult to child, it could be child to adult. There's all kinds of levels of experience in this culture. The members believe their contributions matter, and they care about what other people think. Those traits define a system that's highly generative. It's a system that we see around fandom, we see it around gaming, we see it around a number of other sectors where DIY aesthetics sort of operate in the culture at the moment. So I wrote, not every member must contribute, but all must believe they're free to contribute when they're ready, and then what they contribute will be appropriately valued. So what I'm describing there is a logic of what Jean Lave calls legitimate peripheral participation. And she's saying that there's a kind of learning that takes place when we're lurking on the sidelines, watching things, getting ready to participate. And she says we should make a distinction between people who are waiting to participate and those who are structurally blocked from participating. The one we want to encourage, the other we want to identify the blockages and remove them. And so at the moment, we're at a place where many people are waiting to participate, and many others are blocked from meaningful participation. And those are two layers of the struggle that we want to think about as we imagine what it is to move toward a more participatory culture. And that's the language I'm using right now. As I had called this a participatory culture, many people note that not everyone gets to participate, and that's a very legitimate concern. So my point now is to say we have moved toward more participation, and many struggles are ahead before we reach the point where everyone gets to participate. Now this itself is an example of participatory culture, because I did what I often did. I put participatory culture into Google image search, and up came the slide, fully made. Someone had taken my ideas, developed a slide for one of their presentations, and shared it on the internet. And I looked at it and said it was a better slide than I was planning to make, so I took their slide, incorporated it into the talk. And this is the way it works, right? We throw our ideas out into the world, other people build on them, they get back to us, we can build on the ideas again, and this process can be iterative and ongoing. And I'm often asked from people in the industry, what would I feel like if other people appropriated my content the way I'm advocating fans appropriate theirs? And I say I put it on my blog. I'm excited when I see people appropriate my content because it means my ideas are alive and being built on by the culture around them. This is what we want to see happen. Now, when I describe participatory culture, I'm not describing Web 2.0. These two things often get collapsed together. For me, participatory culture has a several hundred-year history of people's struggles to gain greater access to the means of cultural production and circulation. Web 2.0 is about a 6-year-old business model which attempts to appropriate, commodify the behavior of audiences, right? I mean, it's great things have come out of Web 2.0. I'm not attacking Web 2.0 companies per se, but I think it's very useful to see a distinction between those two things. Because as you know, the language of Tim O'Reilly makes it sound as if the interest of producers and consumers were perfectly aligned in the Web 2.0 system, whereas in fact after 6 years of watching this, we see every major Web 2.0 platform has been involved in struggles over privacy and data surveillance, over copyright and censorship, over branding and advertising revenue, over conditions of membership and whether your stuff can be portable. There are all kinds of issues around Web 2.0 companies that come because it doesn't fully realize the ideals of a participatory culture, even though it moves us further down the process toward giving us resources and affordances we need to support a more participatory culture. Number 3, content is remixable. So again, anyone who's been watching the last 6 years, this should not be a radically new concept. That once we've digitized content, it becomes really easy to move it from one platform to the other. And all fan fiction does is remix the content of stories the way people are remixing sound and images. It's just an extension of the logic of remixing. This, turns out, is someone had taken images from Toy Story and used them to tell The Shining. So here's Stanley Kubrick, Stephen King's The Shining, told with characters from Toy Story. And it's a kind of playful manipulation of images. So you've seen people have done The Shining as a trailer for The Shining as a romantic comedy. People, for some reason, The Shining is one of those films that people just want to remix. It's a fun film to remix. This is a more political use of it. And one of the things I argued at the end of Convergence Culture was that we were beginning to play with things in our recreational lives that we would quickly begin to apply to, quote, more serious things. And frankly, I see play as pretty serious. But I'm talking here about politics, education, religion, parenting, these skills that we use recreationally are feeding back into our other aspects of our lives. And 6 years after writing Convergence Culture, we see this in very definitive ways that much of the rest of the talk's going to touch on. But there's a political use of it. There's someone in America remixed Glenn Beck, the right-wing radio host, with Donald Duck cartoons to create right-wing Radio Duck. So it takes Disney, which is the most litigious of corporations, and mixes it in with Glenn Beck, who is the most volatile of radio personalities, to create something that just created an enormous shockwave. Lots of people were debating it. The right-wing radio were utterly convinced this thing had to have been funded by the Obama administration because it was too professionally polished to have come from an amateur. Now, I know the guy who made it. He was 24 years old and he was a college student. He made it in his dorm room. Right? This is what we can do now, right? We can easily remix content and put it out there and make it be part of the national agenda with very little expenditure of resources of any kind other than time. It's a remarkable piece of work. If you haven't seen it, you really should. Now, here's the process at work. Shepard Fairey took an Associated Press photograph of Obama and transformed it into Hope, which has been one of the more important American political icons of the last few years. Instantly, it's remade as all kinds of other variants on the internet there, and you can see lots of sort of political comments on it. And people began making tools that you could Shepard Fairey-ize any photograph you put up there. So people were mixing themselves up. The whole look of this image became remixable with almost any other content of the culture. So again, it's politics conducted through a logic of remix manipulations of one sort or another. Now this ties back into the legal culture. This is a group called the Living Room Rock Gods that my student Kevin Driscoll has written about. And Living Room Rock Gods simply create music videos where they try to duplicate riffs, whether it's, this guy's a drummer, it might be a guitar riff or whatever, of famous performances. And they put them out on YouTube, and YouTube's copy protection program was throwing them off because they sounded too much like the original. So they were getting takedown notices, and they were celebrating because YouTube was telling them that they sounded just like the original. So that became the standard by which you want to see if YouTube would take down your content, and you knew you were really successful at copying the music. But then they started getting really annoyed that they were losing all their best content, and so they in fact became a rallying point for educating the public about copyright and what the rights of YouTube users were. And when America was debating copyright changes recently, they were one of many, many grassroots organizations that mobilized against SOPA, the American Copyright Bill, which maybe for the first time in American history, Hollywood tried to rewrite copyright legislation and was stopped by citizen input. Right? Hollywood always writes this, you know, Lawrence Lessig calls American copyright the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. You know, it's essentially copyright extension in the US is Mickey Mouse's age plus 25 years, because Disney writes the law. And finally, we've gotten to the point where grassroots communities have educated people about what's at stake, because it certainly wasn't being covered by mainstream media, that was able to mobilize people to vote, to send letters in, and people knew the stakes of copyright because they've all been engaged in one way or another in appropriation, remix, takedowns, have seen this stuff affecting their everyday lives. And so this, I think, could be a turning point for how copyright law plays out, because I think for the first time citizens are able to really weigh in into the policies. I mean, we're going to have a few more successes before I believe it's stuck. They'll try to sneak things through committee easily, but I think what we're seeing is a shift in public awareness and engagement with these issues. That's part of the struggle over participation that I'm talking about. All right, number 4, content is spreadable, and this is the theme of the new book. And I'm told spreadable is really difficult to translate outside of English. So first of all, I meant it as a response to the word sticky, right, that's been widely used to describe the content of the web. And the stickiness model is I compare to a roach motel, that you try to get everyone into your site and not let them out again. But what we're arguing is at the modern moment, circulation, the spread of content, is much more powerful in producing value than locking down content. What you want is not to lock your consumer in, but rather to have your content spread by consumers across the web and introduced into the range of conversations that they're having. So logic is one where if it doesn't spread, it's dead. And that's the central theme of the book. The content that can't be spread, that can't be circulated by your audience, is effectively cut off from the major conversations the culture is having through social media. Now, people immediately said, oh, spreadable media, that sounds just like butter or jam, and someone made this joke, spreading media preserves culture, and in English, preserves is another word for jam. So it's kind of play on words. And we're fine with that, right? We think that's part of the fun of this word. We're not sold that spreadable is the right word for it. But the reason we're interested in the word spreadable is it emphasizes the activity of spreading in ways that words like viral do not. And I'll say a word or two about viral in a minute, but I find that word a regrettable one if we actually believe that we're in a moment where the audience has more agency over content than we've seen before. That is, viral doesn't really explain what's going on very well. So here's an example of spreadability at work. I was in New York last fall and visited the site of Occupy Wall Street, and as I'm arriving at the site of Occupy Wall Street, a whole busload of zombies poured off. And these were horror fans from the local horror convention who showed up to protest. Right? And we're increasingly seeing a connection between fandom as a network community of shared interest and various kinds of political activity, which is why the Transformative Works issue that I edited has come together the way in which it does. But it turns out the zombie has become a metaphor of the movement, the Occupy movement. It stands in for undead corporations. It is companies that should have died a natural death, but were artificially kept alive by the lifeblood of the 99%. Tax dollars of the US government going to subsidize banks and auto companies and other large entities that the Obama administration saw as too big to fail. That this is an attack on that logic. Well, if I went deeper into that park, I'd see people dressed up like characters from Game of Thrones, holding signs that said the winter is coming, or Lannister 1%. I'd see people wearing V for Vendetta, Guy Fawkes mask. I would see people dressed in a variety of ways. And the mainstream media had no idea or understanding what Occupy was about, because they couldn't find a single spokesperson, they couldn't find a written out agenda, they couldn't find a list of demands. They wanted a unified movement. Well, what Occupy was a provocation. It wanted to change the way Americans thought and talked about wealth inequality. And in that sense, it sought to create as many different images as it could and send them through as many different social networks as possible. So the tactics of Occupy was multiplicity, creating many images in circulation. And they were enormously successful, I think, despite getting almost no mainstream media coverage in the US market, much more coverage over here. That they were successful at getting people talking about them. And you see dramatic shifts in the percentage of Americans who are concerned about the distribution of wealth. You discover that more American youth are offended by being called capitalist than being called socialist. This is an unheard of thing in American history. I mean, some really interesting numbers come out of this period of time, and you start to see Republicans in the United States using the language of Occupy to attack Mitt Romney, right? So we hear about crony capitalism, we hear about vulture capitalism. Now Mitt Romney is accusing Obama of crony capitalism. It's a kind of strange discursive shift. Now, one of the examples of this at play is the story of Pepper Spray Cop. And Pepper Spray Cop was a cop at the University of California, Davis campus who casually pepper sprayed a bunch of peaceful demonstrators sitting in the grass. He just walks along and sprays their face. You know, it's a really horrific kind of image. But it's a sort of story that would have gotten picked up by the local papers if it was lucky. But over the weekend, 2 days' time, people from the Occupy movement created more than 200 mashups like these, where Pepper Spray Cop is shown attacking famous paintings, scenes from movies, political photographs, and the images circulated so widely that the New York Times started covering the story, right? And this became an icon of the Occupy protest, was the image of the Pepper Spray Cop, because he was remixed and recirculated so aggressively. So this, as I said, is the theme of the book of Spreadable Media. Those are my two co-authors, Joshua Green and Sam Ford. It grows out of a white paper that we wrote with Chao-Chang Lee and Anna Dom, two of my graduate students. At the heart of it is a distinction between distribution and circulation. So distribution is the system we've long understood, where companies control the distribution of their content. So the people who produced The Avengers decided that Europe should get it a week before America could. Much to the frustration of every American fanboy, you guys got first crack at this one. Right? It has to do with the global market, it has to do with controlling global piracy. For whatever reasons, they make a calculated decision, this should play in Europe first, not in the United States. Circulation is a new and emerging system. It's still only half formed. It certainly involves top-down distribution, but increasingly involves bottom-up circulation. That is, acts of grassroots people, often unauthorized acts of spreading content from place to place through social media of one sort or another. And I'm using the word unauthorized because I want us to bracket the word piracy for a few minutes, right? Now, the industry is automatically going to call all of this piracy, and it may be useful for them, but not so useful for us, because it begs the question of when is it valuable to them that people are distributing their content without authorization? You know, certainly the newspaper that created Pepper Spray Cop, lots of people benefited from spreading that content. So the question of value and meaning has to be understood separately from the question of authorized or unauthorized, long enough for understand. And we argue in the book that lots of kinds of unauthorized circulation, in fact, are profitable to the companies that produce the original content if they simply paid attention, monitored those acts of circulation, and were more responsive to them. And we can think about the Susan Boyle example out of Britain's Got Talent, which circulated the world, dramatically increased her record sales in the US and elsewhere without seeming to do much damage to a television show that wasn't going to be available in the US market to begin with. That's a classic example where what's shown by unauthorized circulation is a market failure to get the right content to the right people. Now, I said earlier I don't like the word viral, and here's a definition of viral that Neil Stevenson provided in Snow Crash that gets at all of the things that drive me nuts about the word viral. So he says, we're all susceptible to the pull of viral ideas like mass hysteria, or a tune that gets into your head that you keep on humming all day until you spread it to someone else. Jokes, urban legends, crackpot religions, Marxism. No matter how smart we get, there's always the deep irrational part that makes us potential host for self-replicating information. All right, and I'm not going to comment on the Marxism being on that list, but it's Neil Stevenson's quote. But the key thing here that upsets me is this language of susceptibility, mass hysteria, something gets stuck in our head, something that's about irrationality, we're a potential host for information that's self-replicating. If we bought that as a definition, the entire project of cultural studies for the last 20 or 30 years goes out the window, right? We've been emphasizing the agency of the audience to shape meaning, to shape culture, and this tells us culture is simply self-replicating. The culture is still something that happens to us. So the language of viral is something that allows the media industry to still feel like it's in control of a game that it's lost control over a long time ago. There are two discourses in the industry about viral. One is, I can tell, for $1 million, I can tell you how to make your content go viral. It's secret knowledge, occult knowledge that someone possesses. They'll sell you that knowledge. Right? The other is, I don't know what happened, it just went viral. And neither of those actually explain the social mechanisms through which circulation is taking place. They don't allow us to get deep inside understanding why certain communities choose certain content to circulate through certain channels to certain audiences with certain messages attached. And all of those choices are in fact ones that are very much in control of both individuals and groups in a world of social media. And so the language of viral doesn't allow us to talk about that in the ways that we can. So here's a success story that people are calling viral media right now, CUNY 2012. I know it's here because as driving to the hotel, I looked out my cab window and there was a beautiful Swiss fountain and the word CUNY 2012 spray painted along the base of it. So at least someone in this town has been involved in this. But this is a 30-minute documentary on human rights violations by a warlord in Uganda named Kony that reached extraordinary levels of circulation in amazing short time. And I talked to the people who ran Invisible Children because my team at USC has been studying them for 3 years. And we discovered that they expected 500,000 people to see this video by the end of May. In fact, what we see here is that 70 million people saw that in the first 4 days of circulation. So to just put that into context, Hunger Games, which opened that weekend, saw about 14 million viewers in the US. The highest rated American television show that week got about 40 million viewers. So you could take the highest rated show on American television, add in the highest box office success in America that weekend, and still not add up to the numbers who saw this nonprofit group's video as it circulated through YouTube in a 4-day period of time. It's a pretty phenomenal act of circulation. And we can see here, there you see a lot of the favorite so-called viral videos here. Charlie Bit My Finger, Dramatic Gopher, David After Dark, the Old Spice campaign, Susan Boyle. But the fastest traveling piece is CUNY 2012. Now, so this is a map of the first 4 days of Twitter flow around CUNY 2012, produced by a group called Social Flow. We see a lot of interesting things. At the center of it is invisible children, right? The biggest word on the screen, invisible children, means that they send out more than anyone else. And at the top we see Jason Russell, who is the filmmaker who produced this video. He's also a key distributor. We see there Kirsten Bell, who's one of the many celebrities the campaign targeted. Part of the point of the campaign was to get fans to write to celebrities and urge them to use Twitter to amplify the flow of information. She jumped on board really quickly, so she shows up very prominently in the first 4 days circulation. But around the edges here, really dense clusters from cities like Dayton, Ohio, Birmingham, Alabama, Noblesville, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma City, Pittsburgh. Now note, these are not New York or Los Angeles, where we would expect flows of media to come from in the American industry structure. This is not even Atlanta, where Ted Turner's companies are headquartered. It's not Washington, D.C., the Policy Center. These are small, middle-sized cities in the middle of the country who are the primary movers of this video that reached more viewers than the Hollywood release and the network releases of that week. Really an interesting phenomenon, and tells us how power gets redispersed in an age of grassroots circulation, and something we should be paying more attention to. Now, in part, why those cities is because the Invisible Children had spent 8 years organizing and building a network of supporters, particularly targeting the red states, right? This is partially a group that works very closely with churches. It also works closely with schools and universities, and has courted people in the middle of the country as their core activist. And its goal is to train a generation of young activists to go out and make a difference in the world. Now, as we look at the words that circulate around it, instead of one message going to everyone, it's pretty clear there were multiple messages attached to it. So if we think about there being a religious group circulating CUNY 2012, we see words God, Jesus, life, love, world. Those are almost certainly parts of a kind of Christian discourse that surrounded this video. We look at slightly smaller, we see music, universities, students, sports, fan. Those are probably the student level discussion. And in between, a whole variety of other words. So what this tells us, this snapshot gives us a sense of how this stuff spreads. It gets picked up by a variety of other groups for a variety of other reasons who all attach their own messages to it. And that doesn't look like infection. It looks like a series of choice points where people have decided which content to pass along and how to frame it for the ongoing conversations they're part of. I'm going to move rapidly through the last 2 points because I'm sure I'm running fairly long here. Content is global, right? Or stories are global. So this is an image from an American show called Smash. I'm not sure if it's made it here yet. It probably will soon because it's been fairly successful in the US. But what's interesting is here's an actress who was the former American Idol contestant who was performing a Bollywood dance number. And it's a 10-minute Bollywood dance number in the middle of a primetime American television series. And in order to read this number, which sums up the entire season up to that point, it's a crucial piece of information, is conveyed through Bollywood dance, which means in anticipation, the audience is going to understand Bollywood. Think about what that, Bollywood's not on American television. Bollywood is barely in American theaters, and they are usually, because the local diasporic community rented the screen for the weekend. But it's traveled through the culture to the point that it's assumed on network television that the Americans will make sense of this Bollywood number. This, I think, is a sign of the times we live in. It's a sign of this culture of circulation. Nancy Baim, who is a colleague and friend of mine, she's done work on the Swedish music industry and sort of argues that Sweden has had enormous musical successes in the US without necessarily commercially releasing the album there. That she notes that one of the major Swedish record companies shares its headquarters with the Swedish Pirate Party. Right? That there's a kind of logic going on there which says put the music out, spread it for free, and then build concert tours on the back of it. And she's writing a book now that documents the success model of the Swedish music industry and shifting the way content is distributed. We can see the same phenomenon as we think about the Arab Spring, right? And people have talked, at least American journalists always talked about the Arab Spring as a Twitter revolution. And the implication was Twitter was the social media with the tools for organizing. Well, they were to varying degrees in varying Arab states. But we know, for example, in the Iranian uprising that Twitter didn't yet support the Farsi alphabet. So in fact, most of the messages in Iran were in English language, which tells us something about who it was being communicated with. The success of Twitter was less internal than external. The success of Twitter was getting words out past mainstream journalists, past government censors to the outside world in acts of communication that connected what was taking place in the Arab world to diasporic communities around the world and through them to local residents. And shifting and building public opinion and support outside of the Arab world. So again, it's about circulation. Here we see a great example. It says Egypt supports Wisconsin. Wisconsin was back in the news this week because the recall of Governor Walker was unsuccessful. But this is a moment when there was the largest street protest in American history over rights of labor to organize in Madison, Wisconsin. Government workers, unions were threatened by the governor and they organized. At the same time, Arab Spring was affecting Egypt, and people in Cairo were holding up signs and sending messages to the people in Madison and vice versa, connecting these two struggles together around the world. My last key trend. Content may well be increasingly independent. Not to say that mass media doesn't have most of the cards in the current moment, right? And probably will for the foreseeable future. But there are more opportunities for independent media makers to get their media out today, get it funded and get it in front of audiences than we've seen in any other moment in the past. And I think that's what's interesting about the present moment. It's not going to be an era of mass media distribution. It's not going to be an era of, if Europe's an example, of government subsidies, which are drying up across the European Union. And I think that's a serious problem that we all should be concerned with. But some kinds of independent media makers are able to tap into the systems of social media and circulation very effectively to get get other stories out. So this is a film called Ink. Ink couldn't get a distributor. It's a low-budget fantasy film, beautifully made. I really recommend it. But Ink could not get a distributor. And so what it did is it pirated itself. It put its movie out on BitTorrent and started developing word of mouth. And they started getting requests from Amazon and Netflix and the other companies to distribute the content. And so they moved it from pirated content back to commercial content and recouped their cost and so forth on this production. It's become a cult success in the United States based on this alternative system of distribution that I think we're going to see more and more examples of. This is the film, this is the film, that was the film Iron Sky, which is a Finnish film that was mostly crowdsourced and crowdfunded, or relied heavily on mechanisms of crowdfunding in order to get into production, and is now moving across Europe with some commercial success. Again, a different model of how an independent media maker can work with its fan base. This is for Sita Sings the Blues, which is a beautiful, beautiful animated film, and I will be done before Darth Vader. This is a beautiful animated film by a feminist filmmaker that's given away for free on the internet, but she uses that visibility in order to get exhibitions in film festivals and theaters. She sells DVDs, she sells music, and she's sort of not only has helped recoup the cost of the film, but is pouring money into battling for fair use protections in the American system. Last slide, and then I will be done. So we can put all these pieces together and come up with a picture of what a future of independent films could look like. And one part of it is crowdfunding. So we have their Kickstarter, which is a site for micro investments by average people, who a filmmaker puts his ideas out on Kickstarter, proposes what he wants to create, he or she wants to create. People agree to pay in a certain amount, maybe for a future t-shirt or DVD rights or something else, and the funding comes bottom up. And more independent films, games, comics, music are being funded by this mechanism. Lost Zombies represents crowdsourced footage, right? Lost Zombies says, we're going to make a zombie movie, and we're going to hear the shots we need. And they simply invite everyday people to contribute footage to their movie. And everyone knows what a zombie movie looks like. Even Occupy knows what a zombie movie looks like, right? So we bring that footage together, we create something new, and it's sent out to the world. Brave New Films is a left-of-center documentary production company that's done a lot of political films, and it urges people to show the films. So they have house parties, they rally local theaters, they rally other groups to show the films and get them into exhibition. So taken as a whole, we have a circuit that goes from pre-production through production to exhibition, all completely based on the support of the audience and a kind of courtship that circuits around traditional gatekeepers. Now, I don't know of a single film that's done all three of those things, but we're seeing success of each of them individually right now. And I think they look like what a model for the future of independent media could look like. Now, who benefits from that? Well, the people who benefit the most are those that have strongly invested audiences. So science fiction, fantasy, horror have strong fan bases. They're doing quite well, and there's a reason why many of the early experiments call in those categories. But as Brave New Films suggests, political minority groups that have deep investment in the message also represent a good base of support in this. And so do racial minorities, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, women, any dedicated population that feels it's underrepresented in the existing commercial mainstream potentially is a strong base of support for these kinds of crowdsourcing, crowdfunding models. What falls through the cracks are the blockbusters, which Hollywood will take care of, and the sort of types of films that have traditionally gotten national governmental funding, the films that do well on the arts circuit, those that are about individual personal expression, and those that are about national culture. Those are the ones that are most vulnerable at the moment. Your art cinema of Europe is most vulnerable as government funding decreases for art films, and these filmmakers can't really take advantage of these new systems of building support from the audience. They're caught in the middle between a shift in where media making is going.
Henry Jenkins will stay with us for the next break and also for lunch, so it is time to talk with him during break and lunch. Thank you very much. And also this
wonderful
Lucerne
chocolate, yes.
drops.
Very good.
These are drops, also wet, but not rain. It's
Oh, very good. Very
alcohol
good.
and chocolate.
Well, this will keep me, leave me mellow during the rain.
Thank you very much.